Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. Welcome to the webinar, Climate Justice as a Global Movement, the first webinar in the series, Climate and Community, a Faithful Action for Climate Justice. My name is Amy Hong, and I serve as the Senior Executive Director of Education and Engagement at the General Board of Church and Society in Washington, D.C. For participants who are blind or low vision, or perhaps only listening, I'm a Korean American woman with shoulder-length black hair wearing a dark gray sweater, joining you today from DC. I will be moderating this webinar with my colleague, Reverend Katie Monforte. Since this webinar is our first in the series, I'm thankful that our General Secretary, Reverend Dr. Susan Henry Crow, is here to offer her greeting. Thank you, Susan.
Good afternoon to all of you. I am a Caucasian woman, a very short build, which means I cannot reach any cabinets. I have red hair and wear glasses, and I am wearing a red scarf today. It's an honor to be together after having recently returned from COP26 in Scotland, where it was a privilege, along with my colleague, John Hill, who you have the privilege of hearing later in the week, to represent the United Methodist Church's voice. This issue of climate justice is the most urgent issue. As people of faith, we are called to honor all of creation and to establish equity and justice for all of creation. This webinar has been carefully planned by Amy Hong and Katie Monforte and others, and they have brought together an amazing and distinguished panel of experts throughout the week. I have been to a number of seminars and webinars on climate justice, and I must say that this one promises to be very, very exciting. We are living in a time where the voices of people of faith are very important, and climate justice is one of the issues that we can come together and work on to make a radical difference. So as we begin today, I want to offer a prayer. It's not exactly the prayer that we always offer at the beginning of a meeting, but this prayer was written by an indigenous community and published by the World Council of Churches. So hear now this prayer. Forgive us, Lord, for our indifference in face of the destruction of nature, for our desire for excessive profits with no respect for life. Forgive us, Lord, for our violence against the earth, for our silence in the face of devastation of forests and the pollution of rivers. Forgive us, Lord, for our complicity in making species extinct, for our readiness to destroy what is different from ourselves. Forgive us, Lord, for our burning desire to consume, inconsiderate of future generations, for our concentration on the present without taking account of tomorrow. Forgive us, Lord, for our arrogance in thinking that we are the center of the universe, for our lack of zeal to preserve your creation. Teach us by your grace to love all of your creatures and to care for all life in all of its forms. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, for the greeting and for the prayer. A short overview of our time together. After the lecture, there will be a time of Q&A led by Reverend Katie Monforte. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen, and we will end with closing announcements. I am honored to introduce you to our speaker for today. Dr. David Pellow is a Dawson Chair and Professor of Environmental Studies and Director of the Global Environmental Justice Project at the University of California in Santa Barbara, where he teaches courses on social change movements, environmental justice, human-animal conflicts, sustainability, and social inequality. His teaching and research focuses on ecological justice issues in the US and globally. His books include What is Critical Environmental Justice?, Total Liberation, The Power and Promise of Animal Rights and the Radical Earth Movement, Resisting Global Toxics, Transnational Movements for Environmental Justice, Garbage Wars, The Struggle for Environmental Justice in Chicago. He also co-authored 2 books with Lisa Sun-Hee Park, The Slums of Aspen, Immigrants vs. the Environment in America's Eden, and The Silicon Valley of Dreams, Environmental Injustice, Immigrant Workers, and the High-Tech Global Economy. He has served on the boards of directors for the Community Environmental Council, the Global Action Research Center, Greenpeace USA, International Rivers, and the Fund for Santa Barbara. Thank you so much for being with us today, Professor Pellow. We are excited you are here and we are ready to listen.
All right, thank you so much for that generous introduction. In terms of my physical description, I am an African-American man with fair skin, with very little hair, and I'm wearing a suit. So greetings from Santa Barbara. I want to acknowledge that the land I work and live on is unceded traditional ancestral lands, territories, and waters of the indigenous Chumash peoples. And I want to offer my thanks and greetings to Chumash indigenous leaders and elders for giving me the opportunity to build relationships of trust and respect, reciprocity, and consent between my university and their various bands. So today I'm honored to be here with you, so thank you for this opportunity. I'd like to discuss climate justice as a concept, as a movement, and as a vision of change that I think could benefit us all. So I want to begin with the Ipcc's Climate Change 2021 report. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, known as the Ipcc. That's the United Nations body that is tasked with assessing the science related to climate change so that elected officials and decision makers will have the information, the data that they need to make sensible climate policies. So if you've been paying attention to this, you know that the news was not good. It is not good with respect to the trends. The Ipcc's report that came out in August indicated that every region on planet Earth is experiencing climate disruption, and in the forms of including river floods, decreases in permafrost, Arctic sea ice, snow, glaciers, the intensification of tropical storms, increases in drought here in California. I'm no stranger to that. We're seeing an increase in extreme heat events, both in terms of their frequency and their severity, and of course, an increase in overall rainfall and flooding. So climate change is expected to intensify, and this phrase, compound extreme events, is new to many folks, not to a number of scientists, but what we mean by that is we are seeing changes where we see simultaneous or close sequence of 2 or more major climate hazards, like a drought and a wildfire, or a cold snap right after a flood. These were previously rare events, but they are increasingly common. In my region, for example, we had, and still are in, a major drought, but it's been followed by and compounded by wildfires and debris flows or mudslides. And so these, each of those events resulted in significant loss of human and non-human life, and have disproportionately impacted our immigrant communities, our low-income populations, and have increased the stress on what I call our life support systems, which is just a fancy word for talking about our environment. There's also much stronger language in this Ipcc report, like unequivocal or inescapable truths surrounding the problem of climate change. So overall, not actually any new information, but just a compilation of existing research, existing scientific studies, and a clarion call for acknowledgement and action on this very important issue. And so whether it's Superstorm Sandy back several years ago on the East Coast that impacted a number of cities, and this dystopian sort of post-apocalyptic picture here of a roller coaster that is underwater, or here in California where we have wildfires. This is a photo from a couple of years ago where wildfires broke records in terms of their intensity, in terms of the amount of acreage that they burned, the amount of property damage that was caused. This is a year-round season. There's no such thing as wildfire season per se anymore. What I'd like to talk about briefly is just a note on terms. A number of scholars and activists and scientists have said that global climate disruption is a phrase that probably more fully captures the harm being done to the planet rather than the term climate change. So this is just uplifting and underscoring the importance of language. And I certainly won't be consistent on this. I use the term climate change with regularity, and you'll see that in this talk. But the point there is that the term climate change sounds like it's a natural, unmoved mover phenomenon, when we really do need to underscore that humans are the primary cause of this. And so that's the bad news. Part of the bad news also is this term of climate injustice. And I think most of us are familiar with this, but I want to underscore that what we mean by this is the fact that climate disruptions affect communities, regions of the globe, nations very differently, very unevenly. And specifically, we see the global South, poor or low income and low wealth nations and communities, indigenous communities, immigrant communities, communities of color being harmed disproportionately by climate disruption. So that's the bad news. The good news is that we do have a vision, a positive vision of change that we are working toward, and I count myself in that as an activist scholar. And this is the vision of climate justice. It's not totalizing. There are other visions out there that are great, but this is part of an overall important strategy that is aimed at addressing climate disruption or climate change while simultaneously dissolving or alleviating those unequal burdens that are created by climate change and climate disruption. So, we are people of faith. And for me, as a person of faith, I really do zoom in on this question of justice and accountability. And for me, that's really important. And I want to talk about that right now. I want to break this down a step further and point out that justice is, according to every document that I've ever come across, as someone who lives in the United States, it's a core principle of democracy and is also tightly linked with environmental and climate protection. How so? Well, it turns out that the empirical evidence on this is quite clear, that those communities, those counties, those states, and even those nations with stronger protections for women and other marginalized communities also tend to have stronger climate and environmental protections. This isn't a law of physics or a law of nature, but it is a very, very strong trend. In other words, those societies with healthy indicators of equity, social equality, democracy, and justice for humans tend to also have stronger environmental protection as well. So one conclusion you might draw is that if we want ecological sustainability, if we want climate protection, then a really good way to get there is to strengthen our democracies, to work for social justice, and strengthening our social systems that facilitate justice for all. So now I want to talk about some specific cases around the world or specific trends that we see across geographic space that really raise these important questions and give us a sense of where we might be going. So let's talk about the continent of Africa and the problem of climate disruption. The African continent's economies are largely dependent on farming and natural resource extraction and export. These are industries that are deeply affected by anthropogenic, human-caused climate disruption. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been very clear that Africa is the continent most at risk from climate change, from climate disruption. And a number of the things we're seeing there is reduced agricultural productivity that is related to rising temperatures, which is already leading to and contributing to food insecurity, hunger, political and ethnic conflict, and refugee crises. And this is sort of a fundamental rule of ecology and social justice. If you close yourself off to the rest of the world and think that you don't have connections to other human beings and non-human natures on planet Earth, wake up. Because many folks in Europe, for example, are saying, oh, the climate crisis isn't real, the refugee crisis, we don't need to pay attention to that. Well, people are knocking on your door, Europe, precisely because they are being forced from their homes for a whole host of reasons, one of which is the climate crisis. So with respect to the question of climate justice, this comes to the fore because African societies are less responsible for climate emissions, right? Lower per capita energy consumption and lower greenhouse gas emissions than almost anywhere else on planet Earth. And yet they're getting the brunt of the impact of anthropogenic climate disruption. That's why we call this an injustice. Folks on the African continent are contributing the least, in many cases, to the problem and getting hit among the hardest. Sub-Saharan Africa is the poorest region on Earth in strict economic terms. Now that won't surprise most folks, but what might surprise you is that it is the single most profitable investment site on planet Earth due to the abundance of natural resources and politically repressed populations. And so the struggle for climate justice on the African continent absolutely has to be a part of the broader struggle against modern day colonialism. That is the control of people and our ecosystems by invading economies and nations. So again, African societies are less responsible for climate disruption than other wealthier nations. And we also see, of course, the fact that there's some good news here, that the climate justice movement is really, really strong on the continent of Africa. The Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance is a really important part of that effort. And so is the commitment of students like those who are pictured here in South Africa, who have participated in a number of climate strikes, taking a day or more off from school to demand substantive policy changes from their elected officials. And so this is something, of course, that we've seen wonderful luminaries like the young Swedish activist Greta Thunberg lead, and we're seeing young folks all around the world doing the same thing. We are going to take days off from school to demand climate justice and climate action. This is a photo of former Minnesota Congressperson and now Attorney General of the state of Minnesota, Keith Ellison, and the Sierra Club president, Aaron Mayer, both African-American gentlemen who are on a march to bring attention to the need for climate justice. Both of these gentlemen, Keith Ellison and Aaron Mayer, have long been leaders in the struggle for climate justice in African-American communities and for all communities. Again, African-Americans, like the people on the African continent, are actually less responsible than many other Americans for producing carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, but have been disproportionately burdened with the costs of climate change and climate disruption. For example, African Americans live in greater proximity to coal-fired power plants, which is the leading cause of greenhouse gas emissions on Earth, and they face greater vulnerability to asthma, to heat waves, and to so-called natural disasters and food insecurity. And African Americans pay, on average, higher energy prices than most Americans. And so for me, this is really the essence of climate injustice. But again, I want to underscore that folks are rising up peacefully, lovingly, and nonviolently to articulate visions of change. This is a photo of hundreds of indigenous folks who came together several years ago in the state of North Dakota to peacefully oppose the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And really, one of the points here is that, like African Americans, indigenous communities face particular threats from climate disruption. They scored a legal victory back in June of 2020, where a judge ordered the company involved here to cease and desist because this pipeline is threatening, it's an underground oil pipeline that's threatening sacred sites, drinking water, and the lands of indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, that judge's decision was later reversed, and we are hoping that the Biden administration will take definitive and decisive action to cancel the Dakota Access Pipeline once and for all. So again, indigenous peoples are being threatened by climate change first and foremost through the extraction of gas, oil, coal, and indigenous folks have been rising up. Back in 2009, a group of indigenous leaders came together in Anchorage, Alaska, to pen what is called the Anchorage Declaration, which really underscored and declared that indigenous peoples have to produce their own food and control their own lands and waters according to their own customary laws, free from the influence of extractive industries, free from the evil and the violence of deforestation and chemical-based industrial food production systems. And they also demanded that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples be recognized by all of the other bodies in the United Nations that are focused on climate change, like the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. For them, it was, and for me, it's ridiculous that you have these various bodies within the United Nations that are focused on climate change that are not also connecting that with the plight and the needs of indigenous peoples. So I've talked about folks on the African continent, African Americans, indigenous folks. Now let me talk about gender and climate disruption. This is a picture of women with a banner that says no climate justice without gender justice. They've gathered to articulate the linkages between climate disruption and gender inequality, and the linkages between climate justice and gender justice. Women experience greater vulnerability to the impacts of climate change, less access to resources needed for recovery from climate-related disasters, lower levels of participation in the political process that shape climate mitigation and adaptation policies. Women also face disproportionate exposure to climate-driven heat, hypothermia, and waterborne diseases during extreme weather events. Now, some might think this is because of biology. I'm here to disabuse you of that myth. This is because of women's social position across various societies that tends to place them at greater risk of climate disruption, because they often are the primary caregivers for our children and elderly, which means they have limited mobility. They also have limited land rights and lower social status on average, which gives women less power to protect themselves during and after a disaster. Women tend to also have higher levels of reliance on subsistence agriculture, which means when crops fail due to drought, flooding, and other extreme weather events, women's livelihoods may be placed in greater jeopardy. And fourth and finally, women tend to work for much lower wages or no wages at all across many of our societies, which means that on average, women tend to have fewer resources to protect themselves and with which to secure resilience during and after a climate disaster. So according to scholars like Joanne Nagel, the ways in which women and men occupy different social roles in society positions them differentially in terms of their vulnerability to the impacts of climate change, their access to resources associated with recovery from climate-related disasters, and that facilitate participation in the political processes that shape climate mitigation and adaptation policies. Climate change, as we know, is no joke. There's nothing abstract or remote about climate change, particularly for folks who are living it every day. This is a photo of a banner that activists have dropped at a climate conference that says climate change kills. And so, trigger warning, without getting very graphic, I do want to underscore that we are talking about the lives, not only of our relations that are non-human, but the very lives of our human brothers and sisters and relations that hang in the balance when it comes to climate change. And so climate change inducing practices are frequently associated with human rights abuses. And so we're talking about oil extraction and production, large hydroelectric projects all around the global South. Africa, Asia, and Latin America are often associated with displacement, with torture, with execution and mass murders. Because I've never come across a community that is willing to lie down peacefully when someone says, hey, would it be okay if I basically destroyed your civilization so that a country or a community hundreds, if not thousands of miles away can have cheap energy? People are likely to resist that. And when they do, violence often ensues at the hands of the state, the government, armies, and corporations. So climate justice supports human rights, native sovereignty, racial and gender justice, and policymaking centered on peace and democratic principles. I have pictures of two wonderful people here who paid the ultimate price, the ultimate sacrifice for their loving activism in support of Indigenous communities. One is Ken Saro-Wiwa, the late great poet, author, and activist fighting for his people, the Indigenous Ogoni people who live in what is now Nigeria, and Berta Cáceres, an indigenous Lenca woman in Honduras, who successfully shut down the Agua Zarca dam in that nation and paid the ultimate price. So we have to remember that people are putting their lives on the line for us, for our communities around the globe. One of the things that I've been studying recently with my team here at UC Santa Barbara is the relationship between climate risk, environmental hazards, and incarceration, or prisons, jails, and detention centers in the US and around the world. And we are finding, not surprisingly, that of course, incarcerated persons are the last people that governments think they should be evacuating and protecting and taking care of in the event of a climate-driven extreme weather event disaster. This is a photo from Beaumont, Texas, where we have an entire community that is literally underwater after Hurricane Harvey hit in August of 2017. This is the Federal Correctional Complex in Beaumont, Texas, a prison that was placed on lockdown as some 35 inches of rain hit the ground in a matter of hours, combined with the toxic chemicals of the oil industry that prior to that disaster had been having spills on a frequent basis. So you've got this flood mixing in with hydrocarbons and petrochemicals, creating a large sulfur dioxide leak also from a nearby ExxonMobil refinery. The prisoners, the incarcerated persons, were locked down. They were not evacuated. Many of them were worried that they would drown. We are trying to change the policies of various states and the federal government to treat incarcerated persons as frontline communities and as if they are human beings who should be protected in the event of climate-driven weather events. In the state of Texas, I could read you chapter and verse about how many times we've seen this happen. More than 24 incarcerated folks have given their lives in the wake of extreme heat events in Texas. The state of Texas has been the subject of a lawsuit where a judge says you have to provide a reasonable accommodation for prisoners who are experiencing heat in the 90s, in the triple digits. We need these folks' lives to be protected. I mean, literally a lawsuit from prisoners had to be forthcoming to actually raise this issue. In the state of California, the intersection of climate and environmental justice really comes to the fore, where we see that fully 1/3 of our firefighters are incarcerated folks who are putting their lives on the line to fight for climate justice, to keep communities from being engulfed by an increasingly intensified fire season, wildfire season that seems to know no bounds and no ends. So one of the things I want to point out in discussions of environmental and climate justice among environmentalists, we often get the sense that diversity is a secondary or a third order concern. But I really want to underscore that there is no climate justice. There is no solution to the climate crisis if we aren't simultaneously addressing the problem of equity. And so I often say diversity is not just a box to be checked. It's not just an afterthought where you say, let's lower the greenhouse gas emissions, let's solve the climate crisis, and then wait, what's that other thing we got to do? Oh, yeah. Let's deal with equity. Yeah, we'll get to that. No, equity's got to be at the center. Inequality is perhaps the single most important driving force, cause behind our socio-environmental crises. I was reminded by the great journalist, the Canadian journalist and author and activist Naomi Klein, who visited my campus a couple of years ago, that some of the very first financial supports for this economic system that produced the violence of anthropogenic climate disruption came from systems of racial violence, colonialism, conquest, genocide, chattel enslavement, right? So these problems are actually baked into the DNA of our system. Racial inequalities and social injustices are actually at the root of the foundation of our environmental challenges. So we've got to make sure that we center them in our solutions. So speaking of solutions, there are a number of global climate policy efforts underway that we are likely familiar with. We could go back to 1992, where the United Nations Framework Convention on Global Climate Change came into existence with the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, stabilizing those greenhouse gases, embracing poverty reduction, and making sure that low wealth nations had the technology that they need to actually achieve those goals. Then we had the Kyoto Protocol that really supplements that broader framework convention and put forth legally binding measures to reduce climate emissions and instituted a cap and trade program. And then, of course, we have the Clean Development Mechanism, which is also part of the Kyoto Protocol. And this is what we call an offset scheme. Unfortunately, offsets are something that I don't have a lot of confidence in because they tend to allow people to game the system. I would love to have a debate with somebody who thinks they are a good idea, but we see large hydroelectric dams, which are a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, coal-fired power plants, the #1 perpetrator of climate change gas emissions, and agrofuels. These things are programs and practices that actually have received credits under emissions trading and offset schemes. So we've got to be cautious about that. We also, of course, have the Paris Agreement, which many conservatives, including Donald Trump, thinks it just goes too far and it's evil and it's so transformative that's going to wreck our economy. That's fascinating because it has no teeth, Trump. Action is entirely voluntary. Not so sure why he thinks this is such a boogeyman, but the aim here, again, is to build on those previous policies with the goal of limiting global temperature rise to below 2 degrees Celsius, 1.5 Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels. What I'm more excited about is more creative, outside of the box thinking that happens away from the United Nations in many cases, like the Under 2 Coalition. This is a coalition of nearly 200 governments around planet Earth who have said, you know what, regardless of what happens at the next conference of the party, COP26 or COP27, regardless of what happens in Washington, D.C., we, various jurisdictions around planet Earth, are going to make a commitment to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And these folks represent 37 nations, 6 continents, more than 1 billion people on Earth, nearly 40% of the global economy. I embrace that sort of creative thinking that says if the UN situation just collapses, we can still have confidence and faith in other elected officials and activists who are moving us forward. So the bad news, of course, is that these major policy efforts have failed to deliver. They're largely driven by a pro-growth agenda that is market-based, that are inherently flawed because this is the same logic, the market logic that got us into this problem. The logic that says capitalism produced the problem, well, somehow magically capitalism is going to produce the solution. Capitalism is a system, I don't have to tell you, all of the empirical evidence suggests quite clearly it is a system that thrives on producing and exacerbating inequalities within our human communities and between humans and our non-human communities, and therefore is truly, truly damaging. And most affected populations continue to be excluded or marginalized from the debates. And we saw this just a few weeks ago in Glasgow, Scotland, where due to a whole spectrum of reasons, many, many people, more people than ever before, were excluded from entering into those debates. This is a photo of an activist at a UN climate policy meeting protesting the fact that many people, particularly from the global South, feel that their views and their needs have been ignored at the highest levels of decision-making within the United Nations climate agreements. And he has a point. And the bad news, of course, is that emissions continue to increase, as have deforestation, evictions from people's lands, and land grabs. Okay, so enough with the bad news. Let's talk about some good news, some hope. These are photos of everyday scenes around this country, a kid's soccer game in a park, a mother and her children working and walking to school in Harlem, a celebration, the lower left there, in the Barrio Logan neighborhood of San Diego, where I used to live, in a beautiful area with a flowing stream. So my question is, how can we protect these places as well as promote an understanding that climate and climate justice links them? Well, there are a number of alternative policy frameworks out there that move away from the global climate policy frameworks that we tend to see, that are focused on some of the following ideas: that we need a new paradigm that is rooted in meeting human needs equitably and sustainably. We need growth, but we have to redefine growth. We need to understand that the commitment to infinite economic growth in our major climate policy debates is unproductive. Even a third grader could tell you that infinite growth in a finite natural system is impossible. And we also need to shift from the export-led development model in global South communities to support locally based sustainable economies. And part of that involves the global North, those wealthy nations like the United States, consuming less and achieving dramatic reductions in emissions without relying on offsets and without relying on nuclear power, so-called clean coal or agro solutions. These are what we call false solutions, solutions that only reinforce the problems because they maintain the power and the presence of the existing institutions that perpetrated this problem in the first place. And many folks have been talking about launching a Green New Deal. Many folks have been doing this for decades, one that would create green jobs, that would promote renewable energy, promote public transportation, energy efficiency, and tax the biggest polluters and phase out subsidies. Other alternate policy frameworks come from around the global South, where we go to Bali, where we saw back in the early 2000s, a group of activists from around the world come together and say that we need to put a human face on this question of climate change. And so the Bali principles of climate justice redefine climate change from a human rights and environmental justice perspective. The Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, Pachamama, in 2010 came out of a grand meeting, a global meeting of folks in Bolivia, who said that humans aren't the only folks out here who need rights. Non-humans, whether it's rivers, whether it's the earth itself, whether it's other animal relations, also deserve rights and considerations. We see the Monte Cristo Constitution, the revised constitution of the nation of Ecuador, doing exactly this. All of this really reflects the development of new systems of law and thinking in law that changes the status of ecosystems, right, and constituents of ecosystems from simply thinking about them as things or property to being in the category of rights-bearing entities. So what might climate justice look like? I've got a number of graphics here that come from climate justice movements around the world, including, I'm proud to say, here in California, where the fossil-free University of California movement really succeeded in getting this nation's largest university system to divest dramatically from fossil fuel investments throughout the 10 campus systems portfolio. This is a major victory, considering again that this is one of the largest institutions in this country, if not on earth. And so some lessons I think that we can learn from these movements are around this question of what climate justice might look like is that any effort to achieve climate justice really must focus on the root social, ecological, and political causes of the climate crisis. Remember my earlier slide, diversity is not a box to be checked. This is what I'm talking about. So much focus on solutions in the policy realm today doesn't actually have or reflect the deep understanding of some of the driving forces. Again, if social inequality is a primary driving force, how does any proposed solution to the climate crisis center that fact, center that reality? So systemic transformations are needed. Hence the popular slogan that we see in the global climate justice movement that goes like this: system change, not climate change, which is also, of course, an organization. Solutions, again, rooted in practices that produce the problem in the first place make very little sense. So again, market-based solutions, I think, have to be reevaluated. Now, what I'm actually saying is that market-based solutions can have a place in this discussion. My problem, my question is, why do they have to dominate? Why do they have to be the exclusive, the predominant approach to solving this problem? Look, for me, when we think about the market and capitalism, what I think of is this: the underlying logic of a market-based approach to climate change is essentially this: we can only address the climate crisis if we can make a buck off of it. We can only save the environment and address the climate disruption if someone can profit from it. That is absolutely insane. That is a wicked approach to a problem. But sadly, that's the same approach that the American healthcare system has. I can only save your grandmother if I can make a profit off of it. This is absolutely immoral, and we need to call that out and rethink that. So again, I'm fine having discussions about how various market-based approaches might be useful, but if and only if we can see dramatic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and if and only if they can actually promote equity. And I would say that's a tall order. Fourth and finally, what works is community action at the local level to build political power, to reduce and prevent carbon emissions and promote sustainability, such as shutting down or preventing the construction of waste incinerators and coal-fired power plants. This just happened here in my neck of the woods in Oxnard, California, where a fourth power plant was being proposed for a community that is 80% people of color, 75% low income, and has a neighborhood that is in the 90th percentile of asthma sufferers in the state of California. We already had 3 power plants. Why in the world would we need a fourth? So people came together from all walks of life to shut that down, but to also promote green jobs, to promote the wetlands restoration, the largest wetlands restoration project in Southern California, and to promote a Green New Deal. So many of us, of course, we are all aware of Papa Francesca, Pope Francis, who said that today we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice and debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And this truly underscores the need for moral and ethical and faith-based leadership. And I'll just end with this. One of the many things that gives me hope are the many, many Green New Deal proposals that youth and elderly folks, that faith-based communities, that unions, that environmentalists, that folks of color and immigrant leaders, that queer communities, that all walks of life, folks are coming together that are promoting Green New Deals in at least 12 states in the United States and a number of nations around planet Earth, a really important expression of the global movement for climate justice. And we are doing that here in my neck of the woods, the Central Coast of California. It is an amazing effort. And I'm truly proud to do this because we have to mobilize people for peaceful, loving, and nonviolent social change. So a big thanks to my research assistants for all the extraordinary work they do. And I'm happy to end there and take some questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Pellow, for just the wisdom and insights that you just offered us. So much critical analysis and examples of how we need to reframe and create new systems to emphasize the change that we need for climate justice and to approach the issue of climate disruption in our world today. My name is Reverend Katie Monforte, and I'm leading the question and answer time. For accessibility purposes, I'm Latina. I have brown hair and brown eyes, and I'm sitting in my office today. One of our participants asked the question of how critical race theory and education around that impacts the environmental justice movement.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think that's a really important question. I think it very much does. And I think when I think of critical race theory, I'm not only an environmental studies scholar, but I'm actually an ethnic studies scholar as well. And critical race theory, of course, specifically comes out of legal theory and legal law schools, but it is part and parcel of, I think, the broader academic work on ethnic studies, which really does focus on how race and ethnicities and various forms of various social categories actually intersect to produce advantages and disadvantages, and perhaps a roadmap for how we might reimagine our societies across the world more equitably, more democratically. And so I think it is part and parcel of that in that regard. And there's long been a conversation between critical race theory and environmental justice and climate justice activists, really underscoring how, again, our policies, our laws, our decisions by elected officials have to not only be focused on how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but have to also center equity. And critical race theory is a really, really important part of that. It is also important in the sense that this backlash moment that we're living through right now around critical race theory is coming from precisely the corners of society who are also denying the reality of climate change. Therefore, they are denying the reality of climate injustice. So these things are tightly linked.
You shared a lot of critique on our economy that focuses on capitalism and the capitalist benefits of choosing environmentally just policies. So how do we re-envision a system that focuses on equity, that focuses on other ways of achieving more sustainable and biodiverse scenarios? Do you have any policies that kind of outline kind of that different economic decision and structure that we could live into?
Yes, thank you for that. I think there are a number of policy proposals and frameworks out there that I think are helpful in this regard. And I'll just mention one or two. There's been a lot of discussion, and I would agree with this, around the problem. One of the many problems with capitalism is that it is inherently an extractive model. It's an extractive model in the sense that it really is, as my advisor used to say, it's set up on a give and take relationship that you give and I'm going to take, right? So it's a siphoning off of wealth, of value, of blood, sweat, and tears of human beings, of human labor and non-human labor, with very little concern for the impacts of that. And so one of the many, I think, positive responses to this reality and the violence of an extractive economy is a regenerative economy. A regenerative economy would be one that really centers the needs of people and our non-human relations, our ecosystems, one that really values care work, one that really provides a basis of equity for people at all levels of the economy, and one that doesn't separate human beings from our ecosystems. And so there's a lot of great writing on the regenerative economy, including a recent book by the great author Paul Hawken, Hawken. I'm sure you're familiar with. So that would be one response that I would have to that. And I think, again, a number of the Green New Deal proposals that we've seen around the world and around the United States are a particularly good expression of that tension, moving beyond the extractive economy to a more regenerative economy.
When you name our ecosystem being beyond like humans, and I know there's some writings you've done around animal rights. Could you kind of describe what you mean by ecosystems that are expansive, and describe more than our human impact and relations? What other relations are a part of that?
Yes, absolutely. I would invoke a colleague and friend of mine, Teresa Romero, whose a leader of the Santa Ynez band of the Chumash Indians here in my corner of the woods here, where she says something that I think you hear from a lot of indigenous leaders, where she says, you know, if our land base is not healthy, if our ecosystems are not healthy, if the white sage that should be thriving in this region is not healthy, if the rivers aren't flowing with life, if the air isn't healthy, all of those non-human elements, if they are not healthy, there is no way on God's green earth that we as human beings can be healthy either. So we absolutely have, you know, the strongest evidence imaginable that in order for us as human beings to enjoy a strong quality of life and a wonderful well-being, our surrounding ecosystems, like I say, our life support systems have to be healthy as well. So an extractive mindset, an extractive economy is the absolute antithesis of that. And the good news is, of course, is we have all of these models from history and from the present that we can draw on and that we are drawing on to mobilize around that. But yes, some of my work has led me to animal rights and animal liberation communities. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from them, because fundamentally what they're really concerned about at their best is the problem of dominance. And so a lot of folks will say, hey, I'm against white supremacy. We should do something about white supremacy. I agree with that. I'm against all forms of supremacy, including human supremacy, with one exception: the supremacy of love. And that, to me, is what the animal rights movement is about and what the climate justice movement is about: mobilizing an ethic of love and care.
Yeah, thank you for so eloquently naming that and describing it for us, and just reminding us the central pillar of love of neighbor, love of creation, that moves us and motivates us in this work. A lot of what you described was the power of the global movement we're all called to be in. And I was wondering if you could share an example or different partnerships or groups that you know of are doing a really good job of amplifying the voices of the most marginalized in our communities and societies, whether that be partners in, let's say, like Africa, where you began at the beginning of your presentation, and maybe a couple examples from here in the US with vulnerable communities.
Yes, absolutely. So the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance is doing some really, really wonderful work to focus on frontline and fence line communities on the African continent. And by that, of course, I mean those communities that are most affected, communities like ones we see in South Africa that have been dealing with the particulate matter associated with the coal industry there, and the coal-fired power plants that have really put a lot of harm and violence into the lungs of South Africans, into the lungs of flora and fauna, our non-human relatives there. And on a positive note, and of course, Reverend Henry Crow knows this, we saw an agreement coming out of COP26 to try to phase out the coal dependency in the nation of South Africa. And so that would have been impossible if not for the local, the African, and the global climate justice movement pushing to make that happen. We are also seeing in places like Guam, the Chamorro people working with partners on that island nation and around the world to address this problem of sea level rise in the Pacific Islands more generally, and in Guam in particular, and noting once again that equity has to be at the center of this. This can't just be about how do we reduce emissions to produce a situation where we don't have sea level rise as much as we do. They are centering the problem of the US military and the broader problem of militarization that has had a tight grip on the island of Guam for many decades. And then here in the United States, I'm pleased to see groups like Greenpeace, groups like the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition, groups like the Central Coast Alliance United for a Sustainable Economy here in California that really are centering equity and justice and working toward equitable-based solutions and natural solutions. So we have Chumash Indigenous folks who are partnered with folks here in environmental communities to promote indigenous approaches to handling wildfire season. We're having farmers in California who are deepening their embrace of composting so that we can see carbon sequestration, reducing our emissions, a natural solution to climate change that is combined with, that is paired with getting resources to support our small and independent and Black and Indigenous and people of color farmers so that they can continue to produce nutritious and culturally appropriate foods for our local populations while addressing the problem of climate emissions.
Thank you for bringing up the intersection of food justice for us. And many people are asking how we can connect our local churches to your wisdom and work. So one way would be to share this webinar as local church leaders with your congregants and community to just share this education and information. But are there any other ways you think that local faith leaders could get connected?
Yeah, well, I would love to learn more from what folks are doing in various congregations around the country. So feel free to be in touch with me. I will say that our local faith communities here on the Central Coast have been instrumental in our what we call our house meetings, which are essentially focus groups where we've talked to 400, almost 500 people in our region about what it is they'd like to see for a Green New Deal in our region, what it is they'd like to see changed in our region, what they'd like to see less of. And so some of our Lutheran, some of our Unitarian, some of our Jewish community leaders have been very, very instrumental in those conversations. And I feel like we're just getting started. So the faith communities have played an instrumental role, but I need to learn more. So please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that gracious invitation and for all that you shared with us today, and for our participants for being engaged and active in this conversation.
Well, thanks, Katie, for leading the Q&A session. And a sincere thank you to Professor Pellow. I'm just echoing some of the ways that people have been showing their appreciation in the chat box. But I just wanted to add to that, that just really thankful for the way that you provided a global and intersectional view of climate justice, and for your continuous scholarship and your passion. It screams forth from the screen. I feel it, and your activism. So thank you so much. A few announcements before we close today. Please consider contacting your senator and tell your senator to act now for climate justice. There will be a slide shown on the screen. Right now, decisions are being made about priorities included in the budget reconciliation bill or the Build Better Back plan, as well as the appropriations for fiscal year 2022. Both bills could make significant progress in addressing climate change in the US and around the world. You can do so by picking up your phone. I believe we had the screenshot and it's back. That will take you directly to the Take Action page on our website. To do just that. The link will also be included in the follow-up email to this webinar. We offer these educational resources not just to learn and have knowledge, but we educate to advocate, to act. And so we ask that you take part. This webinar is the first of the series that is being offered this week. If you haven't registered for the upcoming webinars, please use the QR code on this page, and it will take you to the registration page. Thank you again to Professor Pellow, and thank you all for joining us today. Have a great day, and we will see you tomorrow.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.